change, not from my end, but from a professional standpoint. And then I've also updated it, in light of this presentation to not just be geared towards speech language pathologists, because that's pretty much what I've given almost exclusively for a while now. But please know the origins of this and of my experience actually came from early intervention. So that's really the perspective that it's come from. Before I get started real quick, I know that you guys have I was looking at your staff and it was like amazing. And even just being in this room and knowing not everybody is here, it's incredible to see how well staffed you are. And this is like, I don't think we had anything like this when I was in Wyandotte County. So by a show of hands, can I see interpreters? Interpreters in the room? Awesome. Only Spanish language, other languages? Awesome. Early childhood special education. Very cool. Speech language pathology, OT, PT. The number of PTs, like we did not, when I worked 10 years ago in Wyandotte County, we didn't really have an official, I think one time we had a full staff PT and then we had to just borrow one sometimes. It was just so that when I saw all the PTs, I was really excited. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So these are just my disclosures. I'm currently self-employed. I was at Children's Mercy until 2021. Working as a speech language pathologist, primarily in outpatient and a little bit of inpatient. I am being reimbursed. I have no relevant non-financial disclosures. These are my objectives for you guys. I want them to be fairly broad, regardless of kind of your profession, your background. Okay, so this is a little bit more about my introduction, which we just went over, so I can skip this. And when it says I studied for my MA for 4 years, I just want to point out I had to do 2 years of undergrad. So it's not just that I was really bad. I had to go back and do 2 years of undergrad coursework, which was really, really fun. Okay, so the first thing I like to start out with is just this basic terminology, because this is still something you'll hear people misunderstand, you'll see it on TV and all of this. Interpretation is the spoken transfer, meaning translation is the written. I think it's important to remember that just because someone might be trained as an interpreter, they're not trained as a translator. There are things that I was asked to translate when I was in Wyandotte County that I then had a coworker go to Children's Mercy ahead of me, before I went back to grad school, and then we worked together. And she's like, "You translated this for me back at Wyandotte County, and I still use it." I was like, "Oh dear God, please don't run that by the hospital translation services. It's not going to be good." So they are one, you don't have the training, and two, it's not the same thing. There are different modes of interpretation. There's simultaneous, consecutive, and summary. Simultaneous interpretation is, I'm guessing, most of what you guys use. So the interpreting begins as soon as the meaning of the sentence becomes clear. Simultaneous interpretation is what you might hear, or excuse me, I'm sorry, consecutive is going to be what you use here. Simultaneous is what you see at the UN. So when everybody's got their, headphones in. Consecutive is after the source speaker has finished speaking, they've spoken a complete thought. That's when the interpretation begins. Summary is when there might be a very long, what one might think of as paragraphs of speech. And that tends to be more of a summary rather than that really meaning for meaning in every word. Okay. So then the big question becomes when to use an interpreter. My view somewhat in this presentation is a little bit broad because I want to speak specifically to your experiences presently in your career, but I also want to keep in mind that you all might go on and work in other settings. And so I want to give you information, or some of you might already be working in multiple settings. So I want you to have that information no matter where you go. I want you to know where the law applies. I want you to know what different strategies that you can use. So I'm going to be talking sort of broadly about that. And I also want to be mindful of your different professions. Okay, so my advice, this is just from me, coming from little old me, and then we're going to kind of scaffold up. I think anytime a bilingual provider who speaks the patient's language is not available, if the family requests it, when a referral recommends it. So if you have a doctor's office saying we use, interpreters when we have to interact with these patients, or if other community agencies are coming to you guys and saying that. And then just any time with communication with a limited English proficient person is not successful. You're going to see that word LEP a lot. So it's limited English proficient, okay, or limited English speaking person. So just so you know, and if you need a refresher, we can ask. Okay, so I literally just went back through, this is usually where I go straight into ASHA, which is the American Speech Language Hearing Association, but I wanted to kind of go through all of the professions. I'm not going to read each of these because I know you guys can read, and I apologize. Are any of the nurses here today?
No.
No, that's okay.
We do have social workers and a nutritionist.
I do have them in mind. Nutrition, I apologize. I did not look at yours. And ECSCs, I will have a confession to make when we get to you. But one of the things I really liked, so ANA, they just talked about like, this is part of your obligations. Occupational therapy, you guys had a fantastic, it was almost like a PDF like sheet that had really great guidance that talked about like why you need to be doing this. And I really liked the way in which they highlighted the fact that language barriers can lead to safety issues. And I think that's really important. Physical therapy, your professional body did the same. And also I really appreciated that ACTA and if I got any of your organizations wrong, I apologize, but I took my best stab at it. And some of them it was more clear than others. But anyway, that it's really a question of legality. Any provider receiving federal funds can't legally require patients who are LEP to use a family member or friend, or frankly, just not use an interpreter at all. We had some more information and I appreciated this. I got this from an article where they were interviewing physical therapists about what they thought some of the obstacles were when you had language barriers. And I really appreciated that this person again talked about the safety issue. If you think about some of the things we're asking people to do physically with their bodies, are we doing feeding therapy? Are we doing positioning? It is really important that they understand your words. And I think one of the things to remind yourself when you're, maybe it's, you're not feeling like, oh, it's such a pain to get an interpreter, or we don't have one available, I can't schedule it. I think you have to ask yourself, am I important? Is what I have to say important? Does what I say matter? Well, if what you say is important, if your role on the team, if your role and your job are important, then the answer is yes, because really not only are you degrading the family's experience, you're also degrading your own professional importance if you don't use one. So ASHA is a little bit different, and it might sound at first like they're trying to say that like, maybe they're kind of hedging like on, it might be a viable option. And I want to emphasize why ASHA kind of has this position of when a bilingual speech language pathologist or audiologist is not available, our profession is very, very language heavy, and not just the part where we're communicating, but just also the knowledge we have to have of language and the language of the child, the family, the patient, what have you. Okay, so then this is what ASHA said, and then I have highlighted this. And basically what they're saying is that, it is most appropriate. The language, we need to communicate with the person in the language that is most appropriate to them, and that it might be necessary to collaborate with an interpreter. The first thing ASHA really wants you to do is try to use your resources, find a bilingual provider within the community. Again, that's not always possible. I mean, the reality is, I must admit, I meant to look, but I think in the state of Kansas, the last time I looked, there were like, I want to say it was like 5 of us that were indicated that were Spanish speaking. And then in the state of Missouri, there was like 7. And I'm sure it's more than that because they don't necessarily capture everybody. But the last time I checked, at some point in time, there were like, at one point in time, I think there were 8 of us in the Kansas City. No, it might have been less. It might have been like 5 of us in the Kansas City area. But I would say I know since that time, I'm not working anywhere specifically right now. Another one's getting her PhD. There's different levels of proficiency that some people might be more adept. So really, it is going to come down to you all as providers, and that means using an interpreter. Social work was really fantastic. They talked about not only the importance of using an interpreter to make sure you're communicating. They talked about making sure they're not discriminating. And also it talked about social work's role in terms of being an advocate for the patient and really advocating for that use of an interpreter. So it kind of went even above and beyond with social work, which I really appreciated. And I would say for speech language pathology, given our knowledge of language, we should have a role as an advocate as well. And then social work I really liked is that it just talked about how language barriers play a significant role in how the services are delivered, received, and understood. And it really talked about how there's a reduction in the quality of care when proper communication isn't used. And I think, again, we just keep coming back to that. So then it kind of scaffolds through. I kind of go ahead and hit you with some federal law. I know you guys aren't in Part B, I know you're Part C, but I just started with Part B. So just again, talks about our practices cannot be discriminatory. They have to be accessible to everyone in the same way. So the services and the quality of services you're giving to English speaking families has to be the same that you were given to families that speak a language other than English. Part C talked about that public agencies have to take whatever action is necessary to ensure that the parent understands the proceedings of the IEP meeting. And I would go on to say, I think that also applies to service provision, right? As an extension of that legally binding IEP contract that you make. They talked about how another thing, that we all know about Part C is how much we talk about the natural environment. Okay. So more recently, I think there was clarification within Part C about the fact that because we're talking so much about the natural environment, that we need to talk about the language. What is the language that is used in that natural environment? So we talk about how the children need to be able to use their first language as they naturally would without interference from the support team. Okay. And I would argue that interference would include not using an interpreter. And so there were changes to the reauthorization, included revising to make sure they were defining native language more clearly. So that was the language that's used by the parents of the child, except as provided in a certain paragraph, which was not really relevant. It was kind of a very specific thing, but it had to do with like what languages are people using in direct contact with the child in the home or the learning environment. Okay, so then we kind of scaffold up and we get to the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974. So again, we're talking about equal educational opportunities. If you were providing services in Part C in the native language and the natural language of the home environment to English speakers, you need to be doing the same to people who speak other languages. And I think this is also important to keep in mind is that not only is it just kind of like, hey, you're doing it wrong, but you can lose funding. I mean, when it comes down to it, if you are not doing this the correct way, you're in violation of federal law and you can lose your funding. So this is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is what says that you can't discriminate on the grounds of race, color, or national origin. And then there was an ordinance in the year 2000 that basically made it more clear that language falls under that provision as well. Okay. So that brings up the question, who is bound by Title VI? I'm going to tell you guys right now, surprise, anywhere you will ever possibly work is bound by this law. Whether your patient is a patient that is getting services for federal funding or not, if your agency receives federal funding, you are bound by Title VI. And you are compromising the funding if you are not providing adequate services, including interpretation. And then there's also laws within the Affordable Care Act that also talk about that kind of further strengthen that idea that any health program or activity, any part of which is receiving federal financial assistance, including credit subsidies or contracts of insurance, or under any program or activity that is administered by an executive agency or any entity established under this title. So again, everywhere. So it also talks about language assistance requirements. So it's going to go through that. And it talks about there's multiple factors, but you need to be providing oral language assistance, including interpretation in non-English languages provided in person or remotely by a qualified interpreter. Again, I really kind of appreciated, I think it was ACTA that talked about who can be used as an interpreter. And we're going to get into that a little bit more here. They talk about there's legal protections, and they talk about you have to take reasonable steps to include the provision of language assistance, such as oral language assistance or written translation. So basically, what do all of these laws have in common? It comes down to non-discrimination, right? And that's what we're looking at when we're talking about Title VI. We're talking about equal access to the same high quality services that you all would provide in any home. It needs to be the same across the board. So who should not be used as an interpreter? Family members absolutely should not be used as an interpreter. Has anyone, and I don't necessarily mean specific to this workplace, but has anyone worked anywhere where someone other than an interpreter has been used as an interpreter? Show of hands. Yeah, may I ask, just out of curiosity, were those environments, did you see it in schools? Did you see it in hospitals? A mix of all? Looking just by some nodding hands. Okay. Yeah, so why isn't that great? Well, a couple of things. One, we don't know what their language proficiency is, both in the target language and then also in English. There could be breaches of confidentiality. The interpretation could become subjective, and it might change the relationship dynamics in the family. When I worked for Wyandotte County for Toddler Services, we worked with a child that was receiving multiple services. His mother's uterus ruptured when she was delivering, and it took a long time for the doctors to be responsive to that. And so the child was without oxygen for quite a long time. And so he was really profoundly impaired by that experience. And so she was supposed to be getting home nursing, and there were problems with the home nursing, and it wasn't happening consistently. And she was really angry. And so she would call and talk to the agency, and her teenage son would be the person to interpret. And he didn't want to say the things that she was saying to this adult person on the phone. And so it wasn't really being conveyed. And so finally we had to have a meeting with interpreters on both sides to make sure her concerns were really fully being conveyed. When I was at Children's Mercy, there was a time that there was a scheduling mishap where a patient of mine who was coming to get a language evaluation prior to a dyslexia evaluation went to the wrong location. And if any of you are familiar with the dyslexia evaluations at Children's Mercy, all took place at College Boulevard. I was downtown. So the family had gotten paperwork that had mentioned College Boulevard, but that was for their second appointment, but they went there. And the person at the front desk talked to the family and was like, hey, we're trying to get her out here. So then I was on my way to them. And then by the time I got to College Boulevard, the family had gone. And I was like, what happened? And they were like, well, it was kind of hard to communicate with the kid, but he was trying to tell us what was going on and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, he might have a language disorder. Like, not only should he not be interpreting for his mother because he's 8, but also like, when I did the evaluation, I was like, he has a language disorder. Like, he can't communicate effectively, period, so yeah. So again, other reasons why, that's not a great way to do that. Administrative staff, it's really it's not their role and responsibility. And they might not have the training. Facilities staff, sometimes people will just grab like a housekeeper or like a security guard. And again, these people are not trained. We use very specific vocabulary. When I was hired as an interpreter for Wyandotte County Infant Toddler Services, I should have said this to begin with, my Spanish was all academic. I did not have training as an interpreter, and I really didn't know a lot of developmental vocabulary. And so I did the work of like really learning and trying to soak up, but there's things you can't anticipate until you're in it, until you're in the past, they gave the Hawaii Early Learning Profile, and before you're like, goes down a slide, swings, and I'm like, I have never used those words in Spanish before. Like, I lived with an older couple, and like, we didn't talk about those things. Like, I had an odd amount of vocabulary about health issues, but I didn't know, like, like I talk about rheumatoid arthritis and things like that, and diabetes, but I was like, well, none of them about swings. So there's a lot of really specific vocabulary. And so you just can't grab whomever it is off the street. Okay, so then we get to like, well, what does the law say? So there is no national, like well-established national certification, like universal program certifying interpreters for healthcare and education. And really, education programs like this fall under healthcare interpreting. There is for legal interpreting, which I think there should be, but it's like, why not for healthcare? Like, that seems equally important. And so that's something that's emerging. This is one of the things that has not changed since I first gave this presentation 10 years ago. They are working on it. There's more, but it's still not any kind of a universal program. When I worked at Children's Mercy, they had developed a program in-house that used a program that ultimately I did go to within like 3 months of starting at Wyandotte County. I went to a program called Bridging the Gap that was put on by Jewish Vocational Services. A lot of people in the community, I even see a head nodding. It's a well-regarded program. It's one that's administered nationally. Children's Mercy had also developed a program with that they had adopted, or they hadn't developed it, excuse me, it was developed by Kaiser Permanente, but they had adopted it, that assessed the proficiency of staff members, and they could distinguish, okay, you are proficient enough that you can just give directions, say hi, hello, that kind of thing, maybe read off some minor sort of medical directions. You could not provide services in the target language. And then there was, you can provide services in the target language, which me and the other Spanish language or Spanish speaking speech language pathologists all achieved that level so that we could do that. Now, once we achieved that, we went through a training, and one of the most important things they said to us was, you are not an interpreter. People are going to come up to you, they're going to ask you to interpret. That is not your role. And even though I had interpretation training, I was like, I'm not an interpreter. That's not my role. And that is also for legal reasons. I mean, if you think about it, you're giving out this medical advice. You can be sued if people can come back and say, this happened because you gave me this advice, but you didn't transmit it to me in a way that I could understand. Okay, so I talked about those other trainings and certifications that exist. Again, getting back to the Affordable Care Act, there are specifications here that talk about there are principles under civil rights law that we can't discriminate. And so covered entities are prohibited from using low quality video, remote interpreting services, or relying on unqualified staff, translators when providing language assistance services. So that makes it clear. You really are supposed to be using trained professionals. That is the best thing to do. So again, this kind of goes into a little bit more detail there. And again, I'm not going to promise I'm not, I know you all know how to read. So let's talk about your needs within Johnson County. So, my sense is that from looking at the census for the past several years, the number of people within Johnson County that are speaking languages other than English is rapidly increasing. The primary language is Spanish. I could not find the most current data from 2021 on that. The other thing that I found that's interesting is that they usually start talking about individuals once they're 5. They don't really talk about under age 5. But my sense is, without having data to back it up, is that it's just going to keep growing, particularly in that under 3 population. I don't know what happened with this. Oh, no, I do. Because I have a question. I've been surprised myself with my animation. So I just kind of wanted to ask the room, and I hope you all feel free to share, and whether it's the interpreters or the other staff members, what processes do you guys have in place here to ensure the same quality of sessions for LEP families who use interpreters and non-LEP families who don't? Any sort of things you guys know about what your processes are, what the expectations are, and all of that?
I'm very curious, actually.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk last.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Do you guys know, who makes, so let me start by saying this. Who makes the determination whether or not an interpreter is scheduled? How does that happen? In the intake. Okay. And is the intake, do the interpreters help with the intake for Spanish speakers? Is there a press 2 for Spanish kind of thing?
There is a press, they might not know this, but there is a press 2. So we've got an intake coordinator who handles the Spanish speaking referrals. And then we've got an intake coordinator who handles everything else. And then if another language is needed, she uses Proprio.
Okay, cool. So then do you guys just know because it's on a schedule, and so you're going out with an interpreter? Okay, so that decision making is already done for you. Great. What kind of training? Well, let me hold on before do you feel like you ever notice any differences? It could be good, it could be bad, it could be neutral. And it does not have to be, and I'm looking at the interpreters in the room, this is not intended to be personal to you, because I remember kind of watching, and I'll talk about my experience as an interpreter, what I observed. But for the providers or the interpreter, well, do the interpreters go out on any solo visits? Is there any time? Okay. So when I was at Wyandotte County, it got to the point where I became, I did a little bit of family service coordination and intake. I would do that intake visit. So I wasn't sure if that was happening or not. Okay. So interpreters, you would not know the difference. So I won't call upon you, but I would like to hear from you guys. Do you notice a difference? Again, good, bad, neutral, about the difference between visits with and without an interpreter? Anybody want to share? Yeah.
Definitely. Well, if they're only speaking another language, there has to be. But I've had families before that when they scheduled for their eval, they said they didn't need an interpreter. Not necessarily Spanish speaking family, but we have a whole variety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, typically the eval team will tell, really this family they feel that the team feels like they should have an interpreter.
That's great.
But then when we follow up, some families will say, no, we're good.
Mhm.
However, then, like, what I personally do on a visit is, you can tell when they don't understand. Whether it's facial expression or the lack of.
That's
response,
great.
or what the response is.
Yep.
And so, we'll have conversations in a variety of ways, but I'll bring up. Just explaining, you know, we've had several times today that I've explained something to you that I'm not sure that you understand, and my job is really to help make sure you do.
Yeah.
May I please have an interpreter join us next time?
That's wonderful. Do you guys, do you have like a waiver that a family would sign if they have declined interpretation, anything like that? Okay, just curious. And I'm not saying, I don't know if you should or not, I just know that sometimes that exists. What do you just notice in terms of like qualitative? Like what are some of, I think you kind of hinted at some, but there are other things you guys notice when you have an interpreter versus when you don't, maybe how you feel, maybe like your connection to the family, maybe your confidence in the information and how it's being communicated, time issues, anything like that.
I think I
like-
noticed that if it has to be a situation where there's a phone interpreter, that is hard.
Yeah,
And when they're in person, it's. much
Yes.
harder.
100%. Yeah, and I feel like I saw you, if you don't mind, if I saw your mouth and you're saying something good.
I was just saying that it's much better to have it in person.
Sure.
And it's the same thing, like
Yeah.
Propio. It's
Yeah.
hard to kind of.
But even I thought you said something about time before.
Time, it does take longer, the emails take
longer.
longer,
Absolutely.
but it's good, I mean, we want it to be thorough, so it's not like. we
Absolutely,
want a
and that's not,
shortcut.
and that's the thing,
But,
I wanna
yeah.
hear, I mean, and just your observations, it doesn't have to be like in a critical way, but that's something I'm
Yeah.
gonna talk about, so.
They're already so nervous that we're there, and so
Yeah.
having somebody in person that they can feel like they have a connection to. I think
100%.
that this, especially particularly the Latino culture really holds us to a very high standard as teachers and medical professionals. So
Yes.
having somebody that kind of bridge that gap and make them feel comfortable.
Absolutely, we're gonna talk a little bit about that, but 100%, in my first year at Children's Mercy. And this was not as an interpreter, this was just as a professional, and this speaks to that cultural difference. There was a family that kept calling me doctor, and I kept saying, oh, no, I'm not a doc, you know, and I am no different than your SLP at school. It really tried to reemphasize that. And she told me that, and there was a little bit of tension between what we were doing at the hospital and some of what was going on versus what was some of the things and the practices that had happened in the school. And the mom came and told me that she was talking about something that I had shared or something that I had said. And she was saying, well, the doctor says, and the interpreter just looked at her. And I think it was the whole IEP team in that case, but she looked at her and goes, she's not a doctor. I don't know what to think. I'm going around like, there's already tension, but there is. Sometimes they'll just call you doctor because that's kind of where they place you.
I might interrupt too.
Yeah.
When you were talking about like, is there a waiver family side? There's not. I think that one of the things that I've noticed, especially as kids are starting to transition into Part B, it would be nice if we documented in the IFSP, the family's primary language is Spanish. They have requested no interpreter, so that way when Part B gets that information,
Yes,
there's a lot more.
there's a lot more to it.
They require it. It's a non-option. So I think again, that helps set up Part B for more success if we're kind of
Yes.
laying it out there.
Right.
And
Because Part B might falsely make the assumption like, oh, they didn't use an interpreter, therefore the child, you know, speaks English fluently, which this happened to us at Children's Mercy, where a lot of times the parents didn't understand the interpreter wasn't for them. So like they would
Yeah.
raise their child in the home, they would only speak to the child in their native language, but the parents were fluent in English. I mean, sometimes they were like high-level professionals, like in, you know, engineering. And it was like, you know, and so they were like, oh, I don't need an interpreter. And it was like, oh, but you've only spoken to your child in this language? Well, we have to talk to your child, ergo we need an interpreter, and it can go the opposite way of you didn't need an interpreter. And then there's sometimes there are assumptions about this child needs to be funneled into ELL. Like we had that problem with, I apologize, I don't mean to like tell on everybody, but sort of equal opportunity sharing. Like there was a couple of families that I met that were in Independence, that they were in a bilingual home, but the children like fluent in English, that was not an issue. Really, the only services they needed, I think, were maybe it was like articulation. and they were slotted into ELL, so they were being pulled out of their classroom. And the mom was like, ELL is really important, but my child doesn't need this, and they're losing out on other curriculum. And it was a whole process. They had to go through like before a committee and present like a letter and all these things. And they just kind of had made assumptions because it was a dual language household and it was a mess. So there's like layers to all of this. And so I think that's a good point, being more explicit about what is the language profile of the child and the home. Okay. I don't know why that repeated, but it did. So I really wanted to ask you that twice. So glad we got that out of the way. Do you guys feel as confident in the quality of your sessions with interpreters as without interpreters? Yeah, tell me, I'm seeing, if you don't mind, I'm seeing you shake your head. I would love to hear, like, what are some of the differences you notice?
We're thinking about like, what's the response of the family or the caregiver, but it's more our response that we're hard to reflect upon because I'm going to state things a lot more simply. I'm not going to go into more detail if the families maybe decline services, but I can tell that they don't understand everything that I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're changing your language, you're changing the information you might have shared if you don't have an interpreter, but you know there might still be some limited proficiency. And that's the thing. That's why we're saying LEP, not non-English speaking. A lot of times we're just talking about, yes, they speak some English, they're conversational, but there might be some medical and professional information. And I used to tell people this, even though I was a medical interpreter, I said, my gosh, if I'm in a foreign country, if it's a Spanish speaking country and I need I'm going to ask for an interpreter. Like, I don't, and it can be very emotional. Sometimes our visits and early intervention, sometimes we're the first people sharing our suspicions about other diagnoses, or we're walking families through, I was with families that discovered after a long period of time that the child had Rets. And at some point in time, they thought they heard that the MRI was normal, because in Spanish, it's not abnormal, it's anormal. And so you could miss that and so they were like, well, they said that the MRI was normal. We're like, oh, you missed the and so we're there with them for some really highly emotional things. And so there's also just that piece of like, have an interpreter so that it also can kind of reduce the family's cognitive load that's already higher just because the heightened emotions. Okay, so you guys have already talked to me about your process, and you already let me know that your interpreters do not perform any other functions. Anything else you think I should know about your process at your system? We're going to kind of start covering some of the nitty gritty about like challenges that can arise and problems, but anything anybody wants to like get out in front of and make sure I'm going to address? No? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so let's talk about what are just the expectations for interpreters. So we don't have requirements. We talked about this. There are no legal requirements. And it's sort of up to like every public agency to decide how they want to vet and hire interpreters. And I think I told you I didn't tell you the full story. So the full story was I went to go speak to Shelly Shabon, who at some point in time was the president of ASHA. She was at Children's TLC, which is now Ability KC, as the head of the organization. My mother knew her, and she was like, well, I was trying to figure out, what do I want to do with my Spanish? I'm not sure what I want to do professionally. She's like, go talk to Shelly. And then Shelly was like, hey, would you want to be an interpreter? Also, do you want to date my son? And I was like, no. Thank you. So that was kind of funny. So just to tell you, this was a very informal interview in many ways. So then she said, well, I think you should meet the head of Wyandotte County Infant Toddler Services and have an interview. And then she had to go pick her kids up. So I rode around with her in her minivan, and we just had like a very informal, and she asked me about my experience. And so, gosh, this was probably like 15, maybe more. Yeah, like 15 years ago. So much has changed. It was very informal from start to finish. And so it's just like, you majored in Spanish? Great. You want to do this? Sure. And then would you agree to do some kind of training? And I was like, yes, please. I would rather be trained than not. And I did a little research on my own, and then bing, bang, boom, I was an interpreter, and I was in someone's home and interpreting. And that was quite an experience. So what is your process here? And what are your expectations? Listen, I can't be worse than what I have just described.
It's actually a really good point. Yes. So our process are you talking about vetting and hiring? Interpreters, I saw some heads nodding about training. What is there a training requirement? Is there There's really not
No.
a training requirement. There are certifications that are available, and if they have them, that's great.
Mhm.
To be perfectly honest, unless we're using Procreate, like our interpreters here, either applied for a full-time job and were hired, or we contracted, and one of them's mom actually used to work here, and I knew her mom. I reached out to her, and she's like, "Well, I was looking for," so a lot of it is one's a parent whose child was in our
I remember you
program.
talking about that.
Yeah, and one is another parent of a child who's in our program. So a lot of it is they know what we do and they love it. And
Right.
to be honest,
Which
they
is
just kind of
important.
say, hey, like, do you need this? Is there a
Yeah.
gap? And
Yeah.
we say, let's do it.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. And I would just say, I think from my like experience, I think it can have, I mean, clearly from the fact that like that's how I got my foot in the door, and then frankly, how I got my start into speech language pathology, that's clearly not an uncommon story. I think we are moving towards having more expectations. And so like when I did the Bridging the Gap program, there was a proficiency component. So I had to demonstrate proficiency, and they were able to report back to my agency, and I like passed the class and received the certificate because I passed the proficiency. But I would say, the woman that I worked with when I first started, I don't know how they found her or hired her. I think both her proficiency in English and in Spanish, just based on her language history, it wasn't great. And she also didn't have training. So the families were kind of used to like, she would come in and chat with them on the side, and every now and then she would pop in and interpret. And it was like, they would say like, oh, would you tell them this? And she'd be like, oh, okay. And they really liked her. And so when I came in and like, just to be like I said, I've learned my Spanish academically, my background, I am half Irish Catholic on one side and half Eastern European Jewish on the other. I don't have Spanish speaking family. I don't have Latino roots. And so like that was, there were obviously and understandably reactions to that as this white girl coming in, and she doesn't want to chit chat with me and doesn't want to socialize. And it just changed the dynamic of everything. And I actually did have one family fire me. And I honestly think it was because I wasn't what they wanted, and that was okay. But I think, part of having like that proficiency expectation and some guidelines for what the expectations are really important. And it's good that everybody be on the same page. And I think the providers prior to that did not know what the expectations were. And then even as I transitioned to Children's Mercy, some of my coworkers there did not know what kind of the expectations were, which I sort of pepper some anecdotes about. So basically, you demonstrate fluency in both the source and target languages, basic knowledge of medical terminology, interpret everything that is said, meaning for meaning. Some people will say word for word, but if you do word for word, like it's like punching something into Google Translate, which is terrible. Like, don't do that. I had a coworker at Mercy who did that once. She started without the interpreter, which we'll talk about why you absolutely do not do that. And she punched something in, and she was doing feeding, and she punched something in about nipples, and it was the wrong word for nipple. And she was talking about like bottle nipples, but it seemed to be a different word. And there's lots of differences. And we're going to talk a little bit about dialectical differences. And I have a lot more stories about myself than I do about anybody else. I'm going to tell you that. Another time when I worked at Wyandotte County, I went into the hospital. I used to accompany sometimes our nurses or our providers on visits to the hospital, because the hospital interpreters weren't going to interpret between them and the caregiver. And so I went along with them, and there was a time that there was an interpreter in the genetics clinic, and the geneticist was talking about variants like 7T and 9T in terms of like that genetic coding. And the interpreter was saying 17, 19, instead of 7T and 9T, she was saying 17 and 19. And so thankfully the geneticist was paying attention, was like, wait a minute, what are you, like, she could tell, and she corrected it. So you want someone who knows, like, okay, I'm in genetics. If they're saying 7T and 9T, it's not that I'm failing to hear the "een," it's that like that is something that's correct information. You want the interpreters to mimic the gestures and actions, copy volume and tone of voice, enter and leave the environment together. Patient confidentiality is supposed to be upheld. They're supposed to maintain a professional relationship with everyone in the interaction. I don't know if you guys know any neurologists. They are very interesting people who, the speech language pathologists in the room, I think could really use some social language interventions. And I actually have friends that are SLPs that we talk about our doctor's appointments and be like, there could have been some pragmatic language training. But there was a neurologist that we went on this visit, and like the interpreter was mad at him, and I honestly don't even know what happened, but it was clear that the interpreter was getting really angry. And they were kind of fighting, except I don't think the neurologist realized they were fighting, which was part of what made it funny. And like, he stepped out of the room, and so like, but it was not professional because I think everyone with typical social language skills knew that the interpreter was sort of mad and grouchy with the neurologist, and so that was not appropriate. That should not have been what was going on. So professional relationship, very important. Leaving that environment with the provider. So again, it's going to be less important for you guys, but the interpreter should not go in before you. And I do want to say, it is very hard. Like, having worked in birth to 3, there's a lot of times that like it just works in your schedule that you see as an interpreter. You're seeing the same family every week. There are moments where there's like paperwork happening, and people are going to ask you questions, and it's hard not to become close and attached to the family in the same way. And I'm not discouraging that. There are just some things that are different about early intervention. You are in people's homes, but that relationship always needs to be, it should not be a very distinct social relationship where the interpreter is going into the home ahead of time and socializing with the family. And that can really, it can end up accidentally disrupting some of the provider relationship as well. And so I will say, like, there were times that families had questions for me, and they wanted, where did you learn your Spanish? Where are you from? They wanted to have a conversation. I didn't say like, sorry, I can't talk to you. Like, we can't have our own conversation. But I would start talking to them, and I would turn to the provider, and I said, mom was just asking me, where I've learned my Spanish, and she was asking me about this. So I was always transparent about what was going on, because the provider needs to know about every communication you're having. And that goes the opposite way too, that the family always needs to know about the conversations that the providers are having, which I know you guys, like, I was with Infant Toddler when they had switched the coaching model. So I know you guys don't collaborate as much, but even like at the time of an evaluation, it's really important that you're not having side conversations, because it really is important that it's transparent to everybody what the conversations are about at all times. Interpreters should be asking for clarification of words and phrases. If you have an interpreter that is pulling out a dictionary, be it on their phone or in their hand, I think some people might go, oh my God, they don't know what they're doing. No, that is a great interpreter. Like, an interpreter who is double checking that they know, double checking that they understand, looking up terminology. Like, to me, that is a sign of like, that is vulnerability. That is admitting that you can't know every word and everything. You're double checking, you're checking for understanding. That's a great skill set. You want to take notes. And sometimes I would, like, if I knew there were some providers I knew that would talk a little bit longer, or families that would, and so I might take some notes to help myself remember. They should never independently answer questions directed to the provider by the child, the parent, the student, or the guardian. So there was a family that I had with Infant Toddler Services that there was a child with osteogenesis imperfecta that the father had tried to run out of the house with the child in the backseat of the car. There was some interpersonal violence in the home. And so we accompanied the family to the emergency room to make sure, because this was a child that at some point in time had like rolled over and broken his hip. And so we were like, oh, you've been thrown in the back of the car, not literally thrown, but like hastily put in the back of the car, and your dad drove off. And so we had to go to the emergency room, and we accompanied the family. And it became clear, like, the mom was fatigued and telling this highly emotional story that also involved interpersonal violence. And at the time, and Mercy would no longer do this, but they were using me as the interpreter. They would now use a staff interpreter. They wouldn't have used an outside interpreter. And I could tell the mom kind of kept looking at me like, would you please tell them this story? Like, I can't keep telling this story over and over again. These people keep asking me the same thing. And it just wasn't appropriate. It didn't matter that at that point in time, I could have told the story myself. Same thing with intakes. I mean, there's things that, like, I knew the answer to the question. I was like, I've been on this intake like thousands of times. Like, I know the answer, but it really was important that come from the provider. And I wanted to go back, something else about mimicking those gestures and actions. I remember working with like OTs, PTs. Like, I felt like at the time that they touched, or demonstrated a body part, it was important whether they were showing on their own leg. I felt like it was important that when I said the word, they said, when they did that action, I was going to do that action. I got down on the floor and I slithered like a snake to talk about making S. And so, like, you really are supposed to be doing that, like mimicking, and it's the tone of voice. And even if someone is, telling you to stick it where the sun don't shine, like, that was my job as the interpreter to, like, you need to know by my tone of voice and my words, if I know that expression, which we're gonna talk about idioms. I'm gonna say the same thing because it's important, like, they need to know, like, I'm not happy, which is hard. Okay, and this was a really nice chart that I liked from, an article I found and I had in my sources that talks about, other expectations, so this was like, I thought, a really nice checklist. Okay, and then this from, Bridging the Gap, this was, an expectations for interpreters that, we received in our training, so that base of the pyramid, you're just supposed to be a conduit. The information is passing through you, right? And kind of your individual identity a little bit is supposed to fade into the background. You're a clarifier, so the interpreter a lot of times is the one who can tell that the family hasn't understood. And they're going to ask for clarification. They're a cultural broker, and we are going to talk a little bit about that, but there are ways in which the interpreter is going to be a good source of information about culture. And then advocacy. Advocacy is a very teeny tiny top piece of the pyramid for interpreters. Interpreters really are not supposed to be like offering opinions or kind of disrupting services or getting involved. I know in my training, there was something where like, we talked about a case with an adult in an emergency room where the person had failed to disclose that they had HIV, but had disclosed it to the interpreter. And so it was the interpreter's job, even though normally confidentiality would be the most important thing, it actually was important for them to disclose that information to advocate for the health and safety of the staff. So it's really only like rare situations. And there were situations where I did a little bit of advocacy, but so there was a time where there was an occupational therapist I worked with for a time who just, I don't think anybody should do this in any situation, whether the family is limited English professional or proficient or does not, 100% for certain they didn't speak English. She said something kind of derisive about the child's deficits and how they were largely due to environment. She said it in front of the family. And unfortunately, the mom absolutely understood what she had said. And so we had to, when we got back to the office, I kind of said to her, like, that was not appropriate. And that's not an okay thing to say in someone's home. So I think that level of advocacy is important. I think other pieces of advocacy were, I worked with an OT who was giving feeding recommendations. And a lot of the foods she were recommending were foods that it was apparent that a couple of the families she worked with did not keep in their homes. It was things like French toast dipping sticks and like very like processed American foods, which some families do eat. I mean, some families come to the United States and they're like checking it all out and liking it, but it was clear that they were not appropriate to this family. So I said, okay, I think without, and I was not in a position to say, these are the foods you should use, but I was able to say, you probably need to have a conversation with the family to have a better understanding of what are they eating so you can make recommendations that actually fit into their life. And so that was a layer of advocacy that I did. Okay, for the providers. So you're going to, you are in charge of educating yourself on best practices for working with interpreters. That is incumbent upon you. You're here today, so that's happening. You need to be practicing those skills with the interpreters until you feel confident in your skills. It's important for the services, the providers to find out more about the family's culture, beliefs, and traditions. And then for you to research how the client's family and language and culture may have an impact on your services. So things like, what kind of shoes are you wearing inside? Like sometimes families would recommend like that children practice things with hard-soled shoes on. And I'm like, okay, so typically like we're not going to be wearing hard-soled shoes. Like it was clear that this was a family that did not wear hard-soled shoes in the home, that those were outdoor shoes that were taken off. And then you come into the home and they were mainly like slippers and things like that. So those are things that you all need to be educating yourself on. And I want to emphasize, it is not the interpreter's job to do your work for you. I had a provider come up to me once and sort of say like, why didn't you tell me that Mexican families don't like mirrors and they think they steal your soul? And I was like, I said, well, because not everybody's the same. That's not a statement that you can make. Like, and this person had been into many other homes of families that were from Mexico. And I was also like, that's, first of all, like culture can be this big, and if you think about it, the same thing as the United States. Like nobody would say like, why didn't you tell me that US culture is you eat ranch dressing on everything? And you're like, well, that's more like Midwest and, Like and it just keeps on narrowing until you get to individual families. And so one, it's your job to get to know culture broadly, to get to know culture maybe of the area that person is from, and also that family. And to me, like maybe that family's national origin had an impact on how they felt about their child doing tummy time in front of a mirror, but ultimately that was about family culture. And so that is your job. And then, there would be speech language pathologists who would kind of go, and this is less going to be for your age, but there are some like developmental, like morphological features that you guys have to know about before age 3. And they would say, oh, I wonder if like do they have like plural S's, and do they have pronouns, or do they have gender like this? And I was like, and they're like, oh, I'll just ask the interpreter. Like, no, you're going to research that on your own. So those resources are there. So that is not for you to ask your interpreters. That is your job. You are welcome to consult with the interpreter and say, this is the work that I have done. Does that track with what you know? Is there anything else you think I should know? That's appropriate. You do the work. Okay, so guidelines, you want to introduce yourself to the interpreter. You want to establish clear expectations. Same thing, you guys don't go into the environment without the interpreter. I had someone we went out with from CCVI that we partnered with that, we were going from one house to another, and she just went on in and started telling mom all this important stuff. And the mom was being very polite and like sort of pretending to understand. And it was about the child like transitioning into school and the kind of services she would need because she was visually impaired. She was like, oh, I just went ahead and got started. I think mom understands what's going on. I'm like, no, because it was a family we'd seen before. I was like, no, she doesn't. And so do not go into the home without the interpreter. Don't get started. Don't use Google Translate. All of that is a recipe for disaster. And so, yeah. And when you're introducing yourself, and this is something we're going to talk a little bit about, make sure you say like, hi, this is who I am. I want to, establish expectations, please say everything that is said in the environment. Please interpret everything meaning for meaning from English to, and then name the language. You might be thinking, why would I need to do that? Well, it happened that somebody tried to send me out once to interpret for a family from Brazil. I was like, oh, I don't speak Portuguese. And they were like, oh, right. And there are times that like you will be sent out and there's been a misunderstanding about the language that the family speaks, or like maybe they speak Arabic, but they speak Arabic from Morocco and not from, Saudi Arabia. And that matters. And so you need to be having those conversations. Going back. So speak in short phrases that convey a single idea at a time. You do not need, when you're working with an interpreter, like I know you've talked about when you're not working with one, you might simplify your language. Don't simplify your languages when you're working with an interpreter, but do speak in short phrases, have like a beginning and a clear ending point. You want to do a single idea. Don't talk while the interpreter is talking. If you're in, say, an IEP, or you're in like an evaluation, and I'm talking about if you were in a school district, I know you guys do IFSPs. So even IFSPs where maybe you have multiple providers in the room, don't say what you have to say and then turn to the other person and be like, what about blah, 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 because then that's information that the parent isn't having access to, that the interpreter can't then interpret. It's disruptive, it's distracting. Never assume that the patient or family does not speak or understand English. That's the L and LEP. When I first started at Infant Toddler Services, I was told a story about, it was an agency interpreter actually who had come out, and there was a family that the dad was a Mason, and he had built this like incredible wall around their home. It was really beautiful. And the dad was out there like working on stuff, and dad was he was fluent in English, or at least highly proficient. The interpreter was coming out to help the providers communicate with the mother, who was less proficient. And she said to the other provider, isn't it so cute how they like to make the little homes look like castles? And the dad heard it. And it was just, one, like, who says that, period, but just to like make those assumptions that somebody wouldn't understand you and you can say derisive things like that, just not okay. So don't assume that the family does not speak or understand English. You want to balance considerations of healthcare literacy along with those that the caregiver needs to learn terminology in order to advocate for their child. So use the correct technical terms, and then maybe as you use the term, go ahead and provide an explanation of what that means. But a lot of times in Birth to 3, I think what was so amazing is that we're the first people, or when I was with the agency, but you are the first people that are gonna be helping these families, a lot of times on a journey that's gonna last a lifetime. You are giving them the foundational skills for them and their child to have success going forward. They have you to be their advocate and their support. You do that family service coordination that's so important, but once that is taken away, they are that advocate. They have to coordinate their own family services. So give them the real words. The last thing is going to be prepare the environment. So you're going to want to minimize background noise. And if you can, minimize the number of people involved whenever possible. If there's multiple speakers, don't interrupt or speak over to each other. Pause between speakers to allow for interpretation. One thing I'll say with the background noise, there were like multiple times that we would go into homes and like the TV was on, and a lot of times it would be on in Spanish. And I think for my English speaking coworkers, it was just like background noise. But for me, it was like, you know, it would kind of get my attention. And then there was a really funny morning show that would always be on when we went to one home, that there was a man who would do, a very handsome, very fit man would do yoga on a morning show, like a Spanish morning show that was like a unitard, that was like a deep V, and he would be on all, and it was, and even the child was like, you know, we were all like, wow. And finally we had to be like, all right, we got to turn that off. The movie Up was on once in the background, and I'm like, I'm gonna cry, you know, or there was like a game show on, and I'm like, what's going on? And it's really distracting. So make like TVs off, that kind of thing. Even if it just sounds like noise to you, it's language to everybody else in the room. And then we talk a lot about positioning the interpreter. So this is the recommendation that we would get in training as interpreters, is that you should be to the side of and slightly behind the family. So that's if I'm talking to you and you're my patient, and I'm sitting across from you, we don't want if I'm the provider, we don't want the interpreter sitting right here. So we're just staring you down, like it's us versus you. So in an ideal situation, it might be that you would be the interpreter and you would tuck yourself a little bit back. That's great and fine and dandy, but those are not really the environments in which, first of all, early intervention works in. And then even sometimes, like, you know, when I give this presentation to people who work in hospitals, it's like, excuse me, I'm just going to unplug these monitors, or it's like, you don't need this. I can just slide back to be next to you in your hospital bed. It's like, that's not the most practical. So really what we're trying to get at is it should not be like a line of providers and interpreter on one side, just staring down the other side of the room. So a lot of times this is the kind of configuration that we're going to be looking at, just kind of a balanced configuration. So it feels like, hey, we're all on the same team and it's not an us versus you situation. Okay, and then providers, when you're doing an assessment, make sure you explain to the interpreter what the assessment is about. Make sure they understand what the goals of the tests are. Let them know, you know, I know you're not really doing a lot of standardized testing under the age of 3, but again, if you work in other environments, make sure the interpreter understands not to provide any like hints, goals, gestures, vocal intonation, other cues. Allow for more time. And this is something that's largely going to be out of you all's control, apart from like advocating with your leadership for, hey, instead of having one person talk, you know, you're essentially doubling the number of conversational partners in the room. And so you need to allow for more time. Again, you're going to arrange the environment. A lot of these things are familiar. You're going to review the results. You're going to get feedback from the interpreter. And by that, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying I want you to have the interpreter do your job, but it's good to ask them, is there anything you noticed that I didn't notice? There was a time that one of my coworkers had come out with, she had come out to assess a family, and we were trialing doing it like on the laptop. So it was new. She was trying to figure it out. And in the meantime, while she was trying to figure it out, this is like a TV, the kid was just walking back and forth in front of the TV like this, you know, and it was like, ooh, had some visual stimming. And so she was like, hey, is there anything else? And I was like, did you notice that he was doing that? She was like, oh, I missed that. And so your interpreters kind of start to get familiar with what you're looking for. And so just ask them for broad feedback. Again, it's not their job to do your job. They're not trained. You guys are highly skilled professionals, but they're another set of eyes in the room. In any report you write up, you need to state that an interpreter was used and the validity of the results may be affected. Again, that's more when we're talking about like a standardized assessment. Okay, so again, similar things with treatment. You're going to conference with the interpreter before the session. A lot of the same things. You're going to allow for more time, and you're going to get feedback. So a way that I really like to help remember this is a really great article that was written by a couple of people, but we talk about the bid process. So this is something good for you guys to review. And again, I know you know how to read, so I won't read it all for you, but it's a lot of the same things. But yeah, it's just about you're establishing expectations. You're making sure you're all on the same page. You all have an understanding of how this is supposed to go. You're going to be working collaboratively. You really want to hear everything that is said. When I worked for Wyandotte County Infant Toddler Services, sometimes like the parent would talk to another child and they would be surprised when I interpreted what they were saying to the other child, because that wasn't the patient. But still, how they interacted with everybody in the home was really important information for the provider. And so sometimes maybe they were like trying to be their more polished self in this, but like we would get hints of how the family ran by how they were talking to everybody. So it really does need to be everything. Probably one of the best compliments I ever got was there was a family I worked with where the child had Down syndrome. When they initially started, it was with the other interpreter. And then I took over. And towards the end of, he was getting ready to graduate, his mom was talking to him and she just went, mocos, mocos, mocos. And I said, boogers, boogers, boogers. And she and the OT just laughed. And they were like, and the mom said, Sarah, until you came along, I didn't really feel like Luann and I had a relationship. We hadn't gotten to know each other. And like, once you came around and you were interpreting like this, like, we all got to know each other better. And it was like the best compliment ever. And I think it speaks to all those little moments shape who the families are. They shape who we are as providers. So even when providers say something like funny or silly, like that should be interpreted. So this is another kind of falls into the bid process, but it's another one of those tables. I pulled several of these tables from this article by Akar and Blasco that's specific to early intervention. And so it might be something for you guys if you're curious to look at on your own. So I thought that was helpful as well. Okay, and so let's talk about some of the challenges for providers. We talked on one, like helping families understand the necessity of an interpreter. That can be a really sensitive thing because we can be very derisive in this country about people who don't speak English, and we can be really biased and negative about it. So people kind of be like, no, I speak English. And there's going to be gaps, as there are with anybody who's learning a second language. And so making sure we are in a very culturally sensitive and just overall like sensitive way, helping people understand why, no, this is for everybody in this room. This is for everybody's benefit. And sometimes, there would be families that I would interpret, they were already answering the question, either with a head nod, head shake, simple word, before I finished interpreting, but I still came along. You guys, it's important that you guys are able to ensure equitable access to information. Sometimes some of the challenges are that underdeveloped rapport with patient and family that I was hinting at. It can feel like, sometimes even using an interpreter can feel like, wow, the relationship is more with the interpreter, it's not really with me. And that's again where the interpreter comes into play, and the importance of that interpreter allowing themselves to be more of a conduit than a person with whom the family has the strongest relationship. Sessions are longer. You're also relying on someone else to transmit information, which for some people, usually when I talk to SLPs, this speaks to most of them, a little bit type A. So having to be like, oh my God, somebody else is like, I don't know if they're doing it right. I don't know if they're doing it the way I want to do it. That's hard. I had an OT that I worked with that we went out to see a family, and she was not, I think the physical therapist did the initial eval. And we saw the child from fairly early on in birth, and mom reported nothing interesting or different about birth history, but mom was in like a pretty intensive light cast for most of that first like several months that we would see the family. So the OT was seeing the mom, and the mom she often seemed confused when I was talking. And I was like, is it me? Like, is it dialect? What's going on? But then one time, one of mom's friends came to the room, or came to she was in the room while we were providing services in the home. And even the friend was looking at the mom like, why are you not understanding her question? You're not answering, and I was answering faithfully, or I was interpreting faithfully what the mom was saying. And the OT was like, that's not really what I asked. And then it was deeply validating when one of her friends was like, I don't know what's going on. And then something came up where the mom was talking about, well, the car accident and da-da-da. And the OT was like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, we're suing the person who hit us with the car, and that I hurt my leg. And then like, I went into labor early and gave birth, as the result of this car accident. And she's looking at me like, why didn't you tell me this? And I was like, she didn't tell me either. And so it was the instinct of this OT to sort of like blame it on bad interpretation. And we did ultimately, I think she realized that I think there might have been some head trauma as well. But so it was like she had all these doubts and was like, oh, and so kind of those seeds of doubt can happen. But it did seem, and this is something I put on as one of the challenges for the interpreter, you can kind of be blamed for unsuccessful communication when you're doing your best. But there's that lack of control, and then there's managing cultural and dialectical differences. So sometimes, like as a speech pathologist, you're trying to come up with simple targets like in, out, but it's really adentro, afuera. And it's like there aren't really great targets. They're not going to like match up quite as well. Okay. Other challenges. So these are ways you can problem solve it. To me, I think you just say, hey, listen, I really think the interpreter's needed. You can even say like, you know what, I feel like I am not performing my job to the best of my ability. So I really would like an interpreter. And that way you can kind of take it away from the family. So there's not maybe like an embarrassment or shame there. Other things you can do to help build that rapport, make eye contact. I worked with a lot of people that would turn and they would say to the interpreter, tell mom, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, no, you tell her. It would be like, look at her, talk directly to her. The other thing I tell people is everybody's favorite word in any language is their own name. A lot of times that I've kind of been doing it here, we say mom, 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 dad, dad, dad. It's like they have names and identities that are separate from. So whether it's Mr. and Mrs. or whether it's their first name, address them by their first name. That is going to go a long way towards building rapport. And maybe like learn a few words in the target language. Like there's sometimes it might be easy to, if you're using certain words regularly and they're short, simple words, ask your interpreters, like, what are some words I can use? Or even just entering and leaving the environment. What are some words and phrases that I can use? For the providers, also that problem solving, listening carefully to what the interpreter says. Like I talked about that genetics appointment where, thankfully the geneticist was listening carefully and realized, oh, no, you're not saying what I said. Some of you were talking about, you can tell that the family is not understanding. Make that eye contact. Just because you have said you're part of the communication, watch the family as they're hearing what's being interpreted, because that's really how you can tell if they are understanding you or not. If they're crinkling their eyes, do they look confused? Or are they just politely like saying, okay, yeah, whatever you say. Look at the family. If things are going poorly with the interpreter, you can ask them to step out of the room and you can discuss expectations. And when it's possible, call for a new interpreter. So one thing I didn't share that gets back to that like piece where interpreters should not advocate. One of my coworkers at Children's Mercy, who was just this like very sweet, kind, like kind of younger person, was working with a family that spoke Mandarin Chinese. And there was a lot of concern that the child was showing signs of autism. And so she was wanting to talk to the dad about it. Well, the interpreter, who was kind of like an older woman, was like, no, you're spoiling him. You're doing this. You need to change this. You need to do that, blah, blah, blah. And was just like bossy and overriding what the SLP was saying. And she was like, listen, you just let my agency know, because she was a contract. You need to book me to come every time. I'm the person you need to have. I'm going to work with you and I can help. And it was just like, and she, my coworker, what should I do? I don't know. And I was like, you need to call her agency and tell them she needs to not do this and we will not be having her back. And I said, and you need to report her to language services. That's completely inappropriate. So that's the kind of advocacy you can do. Now, step one is disrupt what's happening and say, oh, we're going to take a pause for a second. We're going to step outside of the room. Because again, you're going to maintain professionalism. And you're going to say, please refrain from giving the family advice, because that is outside of the scope of the interpreter's practice. So challenges for the interpreter, time management. Like for me, and it seems like you have a better setup, but there were times that I was the only interpreter. And so I would be wrapping up one place, I'd be driving another place. I knew they couldn't start the session without me, which was a lot of pressure. You have that assumption that you're the cause of poor communication. Field specific jargon, like there's things that you're just like, oh man, I don't know that. Even sometimes like medical terminology. When I'd already gone back to grad school to become a speech language pathologist, I helped the agency out when they lost their interpreter. So I helped out for a couple of weeks. And I mean, I had been working with them for years at this point. It was the first time I'd seen a child with cleft palate, and I went in blind and I didn't know that. And I was like, I don't know the correct terminology, and it totally caught me off guard. And so even just making sure you let your interpreters know this is the kind of visit we're having, so they can prepare for some of that vocabulary that's specific to certain situations. Acronyms are very hard, but local expressions and idioms. I worked with the nicest woman from Memphis, who there were idioms that she used that I did not know what she meant. And so, and it was just like, I don't know what you mean. So, and I really liked, AOTA, I'm sorry if I don't know if I'm saying that correctly for you OTs. They had a really nice, like I think I said they had a really nice like PDF you could print that had advice, but avoid Americanisms was how they said it. And that was really helpful. But you know, it was things like, well, we'll make out just fine, or I'm trying to even think about some of the things she said. I think I wrote it down on another slide because they were so funny. Oh, like we'll get along like peas and carrots. I was like, what? Like, I was like, everything's gonna be great. But then even in Spanish, there were things that like families used very specific vocabulary to talk about fussy babies. Like there were like seemingly 7 different ways to talk about a fussy baby, but they all conveyed something a little bit different. And sometimes it was like dialect, but sometimes it was sort of situational. So it could be like mimado, consentido, renegado. And sometimes it's important to be able to distinguish between those because, you know, one of our jobs, and I'll back up and say one of my jobs at Children's Mercies was that I worked in a clinic where we evaluated the development of children who'd been abused and neglected. We are some of the eyes in the home. And so sometimes the words that families use about their babies might be an insight, whether we're talking about not just families who speak another language, but even our English speaking families. We can tell like, ooh, you're stressed. You're like at a breaking point, and I think you need some more supports. And we know that those children under 3 are at very high risk for physical abuse. And so having that correct interpretation of some of those words that families are using and really conveying kind of like that's maybe a little bit more of a negative way to describe that than just like, oh, he's just a little bit fussy. You know, we need to have all that. So that can be a challenge for an interpreter. The fact that families will try to pursue a personal relationship. I would have families ask me for my personal phone number. And this is one of my favorite things to do, no matter who I am or what I'm doing. I said, oh, I am so sorry. That is against agency policy. Like I could really get in trouble with my boss if I did that. That was not true. There was no policy. It was my policy, but there was something nice about blaming an invisible authority figure. I'm not going to say the man because that would be rude, but an invisible authority figure that didn't actually exist to take some of the pressure off of me. But that can be really, it can be uncomfortable. And there's also that emotional pull where, you know, families would be like, I'm getting hounded by these calls to pay these bills. Would you help me out? It's hard to say no. And that's where maybe as an interpreter, you could do things like say like, maybe let me talk to the social worker. We can schedule a time to come back out and help you with that. And make sure they know that there's that need. Okay. Another challenge for the interpreter, dialectical differences. This was one where I think it was one of the first visits I went out on. The provider was working on animal vocabulary. There were dialectical differences I was very aware of coming from, so I did a lot of, I lived in Spain multiple times. So I knew the vocabulary of Spain is not the same. And there's actually a word that you use in Spain that's very similar to our word for like to get, where you can use it like in so many different ways. But then if you go into certain Central and South American countries, it's kind of like our word screw. And then it could be like a practical term like screw, or it could be something else. And it could be something kind of like sexual. And so I knew like, okay, I've got to find a different word for coger or even recoger. So there were things that like I knew, like, don't say that. That sounds sexual. But there were other things that like, you know, I thought I knew the right term. So in Spain, you say cerdo, and you do say it with cerdo. So I knew not to say that. But even then there was like, some families were like, nope, this isn't the word. That's not the word. And so there were like multiple words for pig, and different families would use different words. Now, no one is really going to like yell at you if you get the wrong word. And most of the time they know what you're talking about, but you still they might kind of let you know, no, this is different. Sandals, if we talk about sandals, there are a bazillion words for sandals. One of my favorite that I've only had someone maybe say like once or twice was huaraches de pato de gallo, which was rooster toad huaraches. Favorite thing ever. I had only heard that one like once or twice. Snakes. When I lived in Spain, and I don't know if this was just specific to Spain, there were 2 words for armpit, and kind of like we have different words for our backside, where we might say we have tons of different words, but maybe like, you know, you can say your bottom, but then if you say butt, it's like a little bit crass. There was one word for armpit that was like more polite in conversation, and one that was a little bit more crass. And I was like, I didn't know. And so there's all these dialectical differences. I knew a word for ladybug. And I want to emphasize anything I say here. I'm telling this for illustrative purposes and not because this is vocabulary that I use, but there's a word that's marica that means fairy. And then when you make that like a big fairy, and some of you might be familiar with that word, and I'm not going to say it because it's not very nice, but it's the equivalent of derogatory slang term for a gay man. And then there's what I have learned for ladybug, which is mariquita, so little fairies. But apparently that can also be a derogatory slang term for gay people. So we were reading a book about ladybugs, and I was just like, mariquitas, mariquitas. And they were like, that's not the word we really use. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. The word that I learned for cute was mono, which also means monkey. And so I was in a home, and it was a family that, thank goodness, we had a very good rapport with. And I would use that word to say cute. And finally she said, you know, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but you're calling my child a monkey. And I'm like, oh my God, it's a white woman in your home. And I'm like, oh my God. And she could not have been more kind. And I said, what word should I use instead? And she told me. And so these are all things that can come up. And so it can be something like innocent and unintended, but oh man, it can go wrong real fast. So then challenges for the families, and this is something I hope you all keep in mind. Culture might limit the willingness to complain. There can be an attitude of something is better than nothing. So like, they're just happy you're there, and they're so great you're getting services, and are so grateful that they're getting services. And that's not okay. They deserve and they should expect to receive the highest quality of services, the same as everybody else. And we talked a little bit about this, of there can be this elevation of us as a profession in some cultures, and they're not going to disagree with us, and they're not going to complain. And they also might be worried, what if I complain? What am I opening myself up to in terms of like maybe like vulnerabilities? Does it have any impact on my immigration status? Like all of these things. And so we need to be very mindful of that as professionals. They might not know what their rights are. Some families don't know, like, you have a legal right to interpretation, and it's free of charge. They're not, now, as we all know, nothing's free. So like that's why your Band-Aid might cost $25 when you go to the ER. Is that how the hospital or the health agency is covering the cost of that service? But it is free of charge. And so they might not know that. And then, as we've kind of hinted at, there can be bias against people who do not speak English. So just some final thoughts. I think it's important to remember it is to the mutual benefit of all parties on the team for communication to be effective and accurate. So just added a couple quotes here about what the communication or the consequences of poor communication might be. It can compromise the quality of that relationship, as well as the provision of those recommended services. And also just that effective collaboration with interpreters can increase, it improves the services for everybody involved. It's not just for the families, which should be motivation enough. And I trust that for everyone in the room, that is motivation enough. It's also going to make your experience better. So the rest is all like resources, and then lots of references, which I had a lot of fun changing this to more of this perspective, but I do. Okay, we've got 1 minute left. I'm so sorry. I can stay as long as anybody has questions, but anything that pops up right off the bat.
I'm a little concerned about the use of Google Translate, because like I'll schedule with my families using that. And then I like to give a recap like of my visit if they're at a daycare, like if the family's not there. And so now I'm like super concerned about that.
I would
So
strongly recommend against doing that.
Okay.
One of the things that we did at Children's Mercy was we had, like, I don't know about you, but like, and what profession are you?
PT.
Your PT. Do you feel like a lot of your recommendations, like you have ones that you like cut and paste from a document that you use
I
fairly
will,
consistently?
I would say I just saw this little boy this morning, and I was gonna text mom and just say like, these are the things he did, these are the things that we're working on.
Mhm.
So I keep it pretty,
Yeah.
simple, but, then I hit translate and I'm like, well, I hope this says
It's
what
not.
I
I'm just gonna tell
said.
you right now, it's not
Okay.
good. It's probably not good.
Okay,
So what I would say to you guys, if you have things like that, talk to
Yeah.
Monica and say, particularly, and this is actually something that the Affordable Care Act addressed, which I think there are like elements of it that are still being put into play. You have to look at what are the top languages in our community, and then you have to make sure like signage, written documentation is available in those top whatever.
so we have like that stuff, but like, I'm just talking about like my basic.
No, I know,
yeah.
but that information
Yeah.
too, like anything you're communicated, I was talk about having it translated. I'm gonna tell you right now, it would not be expensive. Like I've had
Yeah.
things translated.
We have a person on our team,
yeah.
Guadalupe, who translate,
Yeah.
or who.
We'll translate, yeah.
Translate.
And that's even better because then because sometimes things can be lost in translation, so the interpreters can look over it. The interpreters that go out into the home and they probably know what you're trying to convey, they can help you with that. But I would just go ahead and go through and like,
Okay,
if you're like
so,
practice standing for blah, 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 they can do that, like practice standing in this blah, blah, blah position or practice doing this. Have some standard things that you don't really need to modify all that
Uh-huh.
much, have them translated.
okay, and
Yeah.
then use that.
Yeah.
I know, because I hate the delay of like not letting this mom know how
I
things
know,
went
I
when it's
know.
with, when
But
it's
what
with-
you have to say really
Yeah,
matters, and it
yeah,
matters to
okay.
you and it matters to her, and it's important that it be accurate. So I would go ahead and,
And
have one
likewise,
exactly like that.
when she responds in Spanish and then I hit Google Translate to English, I'm like, huh.
I would
what
have,
that means.
and that's the thing, it is appropriate, and I don't know what your policy here, but at Children's Mercy, like, we were allowed to like sight translate things.
Uh-huh.
Like, I wouldn't have written it out, but I think you can consult with your interpreters and just say, this is what mom sent me back. Do you mind just letting me know, like, what she said?
Yeah,
And
okay,
that's okay, they could, and that might be something you have to look at, how you're using the interpreters, what their time is to help you with those messages,
Yeah.
but do not use Google Translate,
Okay.
it's garbage,
okay, well, that's
unfortunately.
good to know.
Yeah, that's okay. I think it's natural to like not, to not realize that that's. So broad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. If anybody has questions and they want to reach me via email, Monica has my information.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thursday,
Yeah, I'm
I'm
like,
coming.
go and-